The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kate Humphreys, and I just wanted to thank you for joining in on our webinar about the active marketing of university IP to Fortune 500 companies. Today, we're going to be talking with senior corporate startup development officers who will be describing the IP to Startup program, where university technologies are marketed and reviewed by our Fortune 500 members. The program benefits include identifying IP with market interest to help patenting decisions, marketing IP to corporates for licensing, and identification of IP for startup development. I'd like to inform you about some upcoming webinars. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, we'll be having another one on the Corporate Open Innovation webinar series. We'll hope you join us for that. If you'd like to watch archived ones, you can find those webinars on our website or YouTube. At the end of our webinar today, we'll have opportunity for you to ask questions. And we'll hold all questions until the end to be reviewed at that time. In order for you to enter your questions, please go to the control webinar panel, and you'll find a part that says questions. You can type them in there, and we will include them at the end of our presentation today. And we'll go over this again. So if you forget how to do this, we'll take care of it again at the end to inform you again how to submit your questions. Our webinar today is being recorded, and you'll be able to have access to it again in about 24 to 48 hours, and the information will be here and will be sent to you. Today's webinar is on active marketing of university IP to Fortune 500 companies. And we'll be discussing how NCET2's IP to Startup will market your university's IP to Fortune 500 companies for licensing and startup development. And I'd like to introduce the NCET2 Executive Director, Tony Stanko.
All right, thank you, Kate. Welcome, everyone. So today we're going to have Vicki Scarborough and Glenn Vonk talk about the IP to Startup program. So Vicki was a director of external technology at Sherwin-Williams, and now is an NCET2 corporate SDO and also a business development director. Glenn is a former director of advanced technologies at BD, and is also a NCET2 SDO corporate and director of business development. All right, next slide, please. So I want to give you a little history on the startup program. So most of you probably know we've been around for about 14 years, started at George Washington University, have been doing university startups conferences for all those years with NIH and NSF and some other partners. A few years ago, though, we had a big pivot. Congress contacted us and wanted to talk to us about some commercialization programs of the $137 billion worth of R&D at universities and federal labs. So we had those discussions. We actually had a commercialization summit just before our 2015 conference. And we had Congress, we had some people from the Obama White House come in, and we had about 25 of our corporate members sit in. And basically we talked about, commercialization models. Congress wanted to hear some new ones, so the corporates talked about open innovation and what they were doing, and Congress was very interested and wanted us to do some briefings. So we put together a subcommittee to talk about models to present, and this is actually what came out of it. I'll show you a slide in a minute, and part of these programs are part of that model. We did some roadshows in California, Pennsylvania, and New York, and then we started the briefings. The first thing that came out of the model was the demo day in 2016. We had another second demo day in March of 2017. And then after that, we started the IP to Startup program and the Startup Development program about middle of 2017 and later. And that's where we are right now. So here, I'll show you the model. So this is the model. Basically, it should be familiar to most of you. You might have seen it before. If not, all the stakeholders are here. So you have the research in the top left, funded by Congress, but also outbound corporate R&D. You have what we call researcher entrepreneurs that will take that and create a startup around it. I-Corps is part of that on the education side, but there's a lot of people around universities and federal labs pulling things out and creating startups. Universities have innovation districts, and there are players there. Some of them have corporate, some of them have startup officers at the university. We have our angels and VCs out there, and so that's that box. The funding that's out there is from the government side is SBIRs and tax credits. There's private funding, angels, VCs, and corporate VCs. And then you have the IPO market and the corporate business units. They usually cash everybody out and give them an exit for the startups anyway. So what the corporate said is, look, the one thing that's missing here is really a coordination body. Most of these players, universities, federal labs, the startups, the entrepreneurs, the universities, are all technology push, and a lot of things they push out aren't necessarily interesting to the market. So what they suggested is they can act as a market pull device, a coordination center, letting everybody know what they're looking for. And that's really what it is. So that's the innovation here. And then from there, it got brought down to even more particulars on the next slide. So this is the large model in the sense of, what is it that it does? So this is CRL levels, we call them, commercialization readiness levels. So IP coming out of universities and federal labs kind of come in at CRL level 0. And what the corporates are looking for at 10 is companies and products that have $100 million worth of revenues or more that they can plug into business units. So the model is really to take things from 0 to 10 when appropriate. So the research kind of comes in to us, and Vicky will get into that. That's actually the program we're going to talk about today, IP to Startup. It gets validated, and then it's the IP that the corporates think has the potential to reach $100 million of revenues as product or startups kind of come into the program officially at 1, and then we take them through the different steps here. And they're it's a very programmatic structure to move things on a pretty expedited basis all the way through. We have other programs that we'll talk about in future, but for this webinar, it's the IP to Startup. All right, next slide. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Vicky. Vicky?
Thanks, Tony. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Vicky Scarborough. I'm going to talk about our IP to Startup program, which was really industry created. It's a program in which the universities can put forward their best intellectual property, their most promising technologies that can then be reviewed by our Inset 2 corporate members for market readiness and potential for licensing and startup company creation. The highest scoring IP can be chosen for development into a startup company, which could be led by we have a fleet of startup development officers, which Glenn is going to talk about later. And really what the startup development officer is tasked to do is to help the university identify the IP that has market interest and which way it should go in terms of the patenting decision. Should they go for a full patent? Whether the marketing of the IP, they can bridge the gap between the university and the corporates for the licensing, and also the identification of IP for startup development. Once all of that has been vetted, the startup development officers then come in and begin to help create the startup and get it moving. Next slide, please. So how this program works is that you, as a university, have an abundance of intellectual property that has value. And currently, you may be licensing your technology to large companies, small companies, to further their needs, or you may be licensing your intellectual property to your students and faculty who are then using that intellectual property to start their own businesses in their startup companies. But there's a lot of IP that has value that maybe not is not getting utilized for further development. And this is where we come in. Our membership created this program really to help you submit your IP for corporate vetting feedback, and then to have those licensing discussions and any opportunity to form startups and determine what's going to happen to them. Next slide, please. So what's the eligibility to participate? It's pretty simple. Universities' IP cannot currently be under any type of license agreement or legal obligation in any way. In other words, it's free and clear to be submitted. And you would submit intellectual property for review by our corporate members on an ongoing basis. And the IP has to be either granted patent or provisional patent. It is true that corporations do not wish to talk about anything that hasn't been submitted or protected in any way, because they get in a very awkward position if there's no protections on that intellectual property. So they're very hesitant to discuss intellectual property unless you've already submitted it. We have a very simple online form, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to guide you through how to submit your intellectual property. Next slide. So what you're going to provide is a summary description of the invention. And really, you want to talk about, is this new to the world, or is this incremental to the market already, or is it transforming something that's already there? And how is the current need being met in the market? Is it well addressed, or is there room for more folks, or is it not being addressed at all? And the size of the market that you're addressing, it could be a really large market, could be a niche market, a small market, could be a highly funded market, but could just be a small market, or it could be a new market, growing market. And then what prior art exists in this area? Are there lots of different patents out there that cover this particular subject, or are there really very few, no prior art? All of this is important to know when you're grading an opportunity to enter a market with a particular piece of intellectual property. Next slide. So how you submit your IP. This is the link, and we'll show it a couple of times, but you may want to jot this down. We'll need the patent title and names of inventors, a summary, a description, which is summed up in about 250 words or less. No dissertations, just basically an abstract of what it is you have. What is the need that's being met by the technology in the area in which this is practicing? It will show you our technology verticals in a little bit. And then the current market and the current state of the art of the market. Where are we now? So usually this current state of the art description really is the run up to how your technology is better. Next slide, please. So then what happens? Well, you submit it, and then we have our corporate members and our startup development officers review the information. And this takes a while because we're queuing you up for quite a bit of information, our membership. And then they're going to take that 4 to 6 week time period to review it. And then we're going to send back to the university a report on which your intellectual property will be listed, and which pieces were of interest and which were not. So it really informs you about whether or not this patent has any value, or if it's a provisional in particular, whether you think you should go forward or not, and whether there's an interest in a license agreement, or whether there's somebody who wants to do a startup around this technology. Next slide. So the submission cycle looks like this. It's an ongoing cycle. So at the top, your technology transfer offices will submit intellectual property. We ask that you submit in no more than 10 at a time. Some people have a lot of technology and some don't, but no more than 10 at a time. Otherwise, the system gets overloaded. Then we forward that in batches to our Fortune 500 members and our startup development officers, who review it for the value proposition and in looking at it from the eye of the need of the business. So that takes a little time, 4 to 6 weeks, and then we send you a report back as to whether there was any interest in that particular intellectual property. If there is, we're going to follow up and we're going to talk about what the next steps are, including, you know, is there a potential for a startup company to be formed? If there is, we'll have startup development officers who may be interested in working with that technology, work with you in the universities, and the work can begin. So this is an ongoing cycle, so there's no time limit. There's no deadline. It's like, I've got something and I want to submit it into Inset 2. So this just completely keeps going endless cycles until you know, you get some feedback from us. Next, and this would be like what a sample looks like, what we would send you. So here we've got a list of intellectual property that was submitted, and then the corporate scores. So out of the 30 plus corporate members that we have, there's going to be scores, and basically it comes down to who cares. Who cares about this technology? And so as you can see at the top, we have them ranked. This graphene technology is very highly ranked by the corporates and the startup development officers. Everybody likes this one. And so we asked the corporates 2 things. Do you want to create a startup around this IP, or do you want to license this IP? And in general, 20% of what you submit, there's going to be some interest in. So that's, so if you submit 10, you're going to get 2 that are going to be highly of interest to someone. So that's the hit rate that is running right now with the technologies that are being submitted. And so Glenn is going to talk a little bit about this startup development program and how it works and who participates. And Glenn, take it away.
Thanks, Vicki. It's pretty exciting seeing all of that and thinking about the feedback that would be available. One question you may have is, who are the startup development officers and why are they important in this process? The startup development officers are important because they have a lot of experience commercializing technologies in different venues. They might be ex-corporate open innovation executives. They may have been in aligned business acquiring and commercializing technologies. Some of them are angel investors, and some of them are serial entrepreneurs who have successfully commercialized technology in startups and seen it either proceed as a stand-up company or as an acquisition. They have years of experience in commercialization, venture creation, development. You can see a list of them at the website shown here in the last bullet. So what do they do? Well, they would first work with the universities to create the startups, and this would be downstream of where, as Vicki was mentioning, intellectual property would be identified to them. They would be very interested in that, and we would always look to see that there's access to that intellectual property through a license, and that the corporate has the alignment with their business and technology goals at an early stage. Often these startups employ student researchers, which may be graduate or undergraduate even, and faculty, chief scientific officers, and advisors. The key to this is having access to an experienced management team or advisors and mentors. We have had some student startups that were really quite promising. If the management team is inexperienced, often the addition of an SDO to that management team can accelerate the progress of that startup quite significantly. We like to do that in partnership with corporates who have indicated interest, and would work with them to set up milestones where the startup can aim for, and that can be linked somewhat to funding milestones from either private or public investors or funders. Next slide. So why should you submit? Well, first of all, it'll give you an idea of what's important to the corporates and what they are interested in acquiring from your patent portfolio. It can provide access to corporate licensing, and we don't tell the corporates that they've got to do this work through a startup. If they want to do a license or sponsored research, the door is open for that. And through those mechanisms, you can develop your promising intellectual property. It also provides understanding of what the corporates are sourcing in the different technology and business verticals. It can provide access to those representatives, and often our corporate liaisons are really well linked to their corporations, understand broadly what the strategy is and who's doing what, who's interested, and how to connect them. So building those relationships is important. And as I mentioned briefly before, it provides a venue for student development and coaching through the SDOs. Next slide, please. For the university, it can expand the exposure that you have with multinational companies who compete across the world. The university startups, again, give you an opportunity to meet one-on-one with these corporate representatives to build the relationship that we mentioned before. And we have an evergreen program where you can continue to submit provisional or patented technologies, have been disclosed, with up to 10 submissions per cycle, per review cycle, with feedback coming within 4 to 6 weeks back to you. Next slide, please. So here are the areas that the corporates told us that they were interested in, and they cover a very broad range of technology verticals. And I'll just let you read over that for a moment. Okay, next slide, please. So the corporates engage with us because we provide them coverage from over 200 universities nationwide. It's not possible for them to interact at that scale in an efficient way. Because the corporate members can receive and review and score your submitted intellectual property, which is typically over 400 annually, they can grade them efficiently as members of a corporate selection committee that we organize. And this provides your opportunity and their opportunity to meet you and to build a relationship with you. It's very cost effective for them, and it's an efficient use of their time because of the way that it's organized in the format that Vicki described earlier. Corporates are really looking to create sustained competitive advantage, and that is often accomplished by accelerating and streamlining external technology development. So corporates will often see technologies that they think are interesting, but they're at too early a stage for them, or they're at too high risk for them. So that can be somewhat alleviated by leveraging external investment through public and private investors shown in next to the last bullet to fund them through that de-risking process. And it can also be accomplished by focusing the efforts to de-risk those products and startups in areas which are aligned to the technology and business strategies of the customers, which are the corporates that will provide the exits. So then commercialization is less risky, and there's a better likelihood of success for either acquisition or stand-up. Next, please. So here's our corporate selection committee for 2018. Some of the names, many of the names you'll recognize. Together, they represent over $890 billion in revenues. So substantial global market share for these participants, and you'll see that they are quite well diverse across the verticals that I showed before. Next slide, please. One of the things that we believe is very unique about our startup development program is that the startups are what we say triple vetted. And I alluded to this before, but they're first vetted by universities who select the intellectual property to submit, by the corporates who review it and score it to steer their development and often engage with them for the startups that they're interested in, and by the SDOs who have experience commercializing those technologies in a variety of roles, including corporates, investors, and entrepreneur organizations and startups. All of them are very focused on creating a pull for the technology from the marketplace in something that is very commercializable, not just pushing the technologies that are not going to have value there. Next slide. So at this point, I'll turn it over for questions. You can submit your questions on the GoToMeeting chat line if you want. And Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna skip ahead. Thank you for being part of this. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please submit them now through the question panel through the GoToMeeting, and we'll compile those and answer them here quickly for you. Let's start with our first question. I'm a faculty member with research funding from NSF. How does someone like me work with a program?
Glenn, why don't you take that?
Okay, I think it's great that you have research funding from the National Science Foundation. I would first consider whether you can file a patent or an invention disclosure with your technology transfer office or otherwise. And then once you have that intellectual property in hand, then I would go ahead and submit that via the format that Vicki described, and that's accessible through our website, and that would begin a dialogue with us and with potential corporates that show interest in that technology.
Thank you, Glenn. We'll pull up our next question here. Why do the corporates participate in the program rather than dealing directly with the universities? Vicki, can you answer that one for us, please?
I sure can. You know, I was formerly Director of Open Innovation at Sherwin-Williams, and you know, we didn't have a lot of people, boots on the ground, if you will. Okay, yes, definitely you can interact with universities, and you know, it's not all or nothing. You know, you can choose to interact and put money towards certain universities, particularly in your neighborhood and so forth. But when you're actively looking for intellectual property and for ideas, you need to look everywhere. And so there's only so much time that you can expend in that effort. And so when you have a program like this that kind of brings it to you in a bundled package, and you're not out, as Glenn said earlier, traveling around really trying to go to all these universities, because over 200 plus universities, that's a lot of traveling, and that's not very efficient. So the efficiency is gained by having all this bundled and sent to you. You're definitely going to be dealing directly with universities, but finding the technology to begin with is half the battle. And so having this bundled and sent to you and being able to sort through it very quickly and efficiently is very attractive to somebody with a small department. And most of the technology scouting efforts at all the big companies are not large organizations, they're smaller. And so you've got 2 or 3 people who are handling all of this scouting, and they can't possibly do all this without the help of organizations like INSET2, who can bundle this and bring it to them cost effectively. And there's a lot of ways to get information, but this is a very efficient way to do it. And the reason it's attractive to corporates is because it includes all of the elements for vetting the corporate and the INSET2 people and the university. Everyone's participating in bringing the best technology forward. So it's very efficient use of a corporate's time.
Thank you, Vicki. We'll get our next question up here. How many IPs are submitted to IP to Startup annually, and how many have resulted in license agreements or options? Glenn, can you handle this question, please?
So approximately 400 different pieces of intellectual property are submitted to NSTET annually, and we don't know for sure how many have resulted in license agreements or options. We don't get that information back from the universities. But what I can tell you is that the engagement in the universities has been very strong. They're very supportive of the program. And then on the corporate side, we do have regular interactions with corporates that are seeking us to commercialize technologies that they found through the IP to Startup program. So it's a relatively new program for us, but the feedback so far has been really good. I just returned for a moment to the idea that one of the things that is difficult about many venues where you're trying to source or market IP is that oftentimes the right people aren't looking at it. They're not the right people that can commercialize the technology, understand the corporate strategy, and when they do see it, they're seeing it in a venue which isn't very efficient for them. So I think that what also motivates many to participate in this is just the efficiency of how fast they can tell people about their intellectual property, the scope of what has been submitted, and then the efficiency for those that are reviewing it and their capability to commercialize it once they find it.
Thank you, Glenn. And we'll move on to our next question. So the question is, shouldn't Steve Blank's customer discovery, to some extent, be conducted by the faculty prior to submitting the online form? Otherwise, they all will insert information that could be meaningless. Vicki, would you please answer this question?
Sure, and I'm familiar with Steve Blank's customer discovery. As an I-Corps mentor in the past, I helped our students do that. And yes, definitely getting the value proposition correct after doing 100 interviews of your customer base or your supposed customer base is valuable information. Everybody should be doing that. Not everybody has an I-Corps program. Not everybody is willing to go through the I-Corps program. If you do go through the I-Corps program, that's an awesome thing for basic training. And I do emphasize basic because there's so much more to forming a startup. But getting that customer information to really tweak your value proposition, because there's always a little bit of a tweak in there after you do a lot of interviews. So yes, absolutely. Customer discovery is huge, and I would love it if all the faculty would do that stuff, but they don't take that time. They may not know about this, but if they did do this, they would definitely have much better value propositions than they may otherwise. And really, when research is being conducted, sometimes the thought isn't in their head about where this is going to go. It's just discovery. And so customer discovery and discovery are two different things. So once you discover something, then figuring out how valuable it is would be this this journey towards value proposition and working with customers. I wish it would happen more, but it doesn't necessarily happen all the time. And I believe it's not necessarily meaningless. If you submit it and your university is willing to file a provisional patent on it because it looks like intellectual property that could be protected, it's novel, it's unobvious, etc., then you should file it, and then let's determine through our corporate members, does it have value to them? Sometimes not everyone understands the value of what's going on in the market. If you're in the university world versus the business world, they're two different worlds. They're like oil and water almost. And so understanding the market is very important. And you can get a quick read by doing a submission through Inset 2.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit too, I think the I-Corps program is a great program, and but what Vicki showed is a very efficient way to send your IP out to corporates that know their markets really well. Some of the verticals that IP would be seen by corporates that might represent $200, $300 billion in sales. They got there by knowing their customers really well. And if that happens, then you have a potential customer for that startup, for that IP built into the process.
Thank you both for that. We'll move on to our next question. I'm a corporate company employee. Can the SDOs be active employees of a corporate company or just ex-employees? Glenn, would you like to handle that question, please?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Typically, the SDOs are retired corporates, are entrepreneurs that are serial entrepreneurs, and not typically heading up a company at present. If someone is already a corporate company employee and they want to be an SDO, we'd have to take a look at that and just to ensure that we could maintain, manage the conflict of interest that might arise from that. But mostly we have not had SDOs that were active employees of a large corporate.
Thank you. And our next question is, how do Fortune 500 companies review the IP?
Basically, they have a format, and they're looking at it from their perspective. And as I said earlier, when you have intellectual property, those questions that were on the right-hand side, is this new to the market, or is it something that's already just sort of filling in a gap? The IP or the Fortune 500 folks know their markets really well, as Glenn just said. So there's a list of kind of things that we go through, and they look at it and they can determine whether or not it has any value. And it depends on, normally the technology scouts may be the ones who get this. Sometimes it's the venture people within the company that get this information, or both. And they work together to figure out if this intellectual property is value. Again, it's their job to know what they're looking for. And so that is basically, there's a list of primary questions that they ask themselves as to what they need to do.
Great, thank you. And our next question, is there a cost to submit the IP or a cost to have startups created by NCET2? Glenn, would you please answer this one?
Sure, there's no cost to submitting intellectual property. In terms of the startup creation by NCET2, that happens in partnership with the startup development officers. Vicki, you want to take a crack at that one?
The cost for submitting, there is no cost, and once we get to the point where the startup development officers are involved, we would want to we would look at how the startup's being created, and perhaps the startup development officers are involved in equity in a startup and so forth. But basically, to submit at the beginning is no cost to the TTO.
Great, thank you. And our next question. Hold on one second. All right, here we go. Are diagnostic related IP okay to submit? I did not see that on the list, or maybe that fell into the medical device category. Can we get some clarification on this, please?
Sure, I'll be happy to take that one. So diagnostics intellectual property is in very interesting times now, as everybody probably knows, or if you work in diagnostics, you know that. I would say absolutely to submit it, and I would put it in the category of medical devices. You definitely, for diagnostic related IP now, you want to be thinking in terms of whole systems and not just markers, right? Because of some of the recent rulings. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but I would say submit it.
Okay, great, thank you. How can I, as the entrepreneurial lead for a startup, join this program? Vicki, can you answer that one, please?
Yes, you can contact NCET2 here, email us at support@ncet2.org and give us your contact information, and we can set up a call, and we assume you're an entrepreneurial lead that is interested in startup development, and let us talk with you and determine your level of interest and qualifications to be an entrepreneurial lead. But definitely just email us at support@ncet2.org.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one last question. It looks like a university TTO can send 10 IP per cycle. Is that correct? Do you provide guidance on what the corporates are looking for to help me choose what to submit? Glenn, can you answer that one, please?
Sure, I can take that one. So it is correct. 10 different pieces of intellectual property per cycle is correct. Providing guidance is tricky. Certainly, we see activity in all the technology verticals that I showed on the previous slide. We have had some events where we had maybe 200 startups that participated in these events and were evaluated by corporates. And one of the lessons we learned from that is that both from the university side, as they were looking at the startups that they were working with that were interesting to the corporates, and from the corporate side, it was a bit of a surprise to us which ones were the most interesting to the corporates. So we can provide some guidance on terms of hot areas, but my recommendation is if you have intellectual property that is interesting to you, that you think could be of interest, that you cast the net a little bit broader rather than narrower if you can, because surprises happen. Some of the areas that are very interesting are around cybersecurity, any kind of Internet of Things, or IT intelligence. On the vehicle side, autonomous vehicles and materials has been really important. Do you want to say anything about coatings and polymers, Vicki?
Well, I think your point is well taken in the sense that you don't know what you don't know, and you just submit it because as we all know, corporates are highly competitive, and you don't know what is truly of interest to them, and so they may have stealth programs that are operating in the back that no one knows about, but this particular intellectual property kind of hits a hot button for them. So you just submit it, and all the trends, all the technology trends that are out there, Glenn just mentioned, IT, big data, cybersecurity, those are all hot areas, artificial intelligence and augmented reality, things like that. But really, in material science, it could be anything. And so just if you have any question at all, just submit it, and your question will be answered, because they'll either be interested or they won't. So it'll hit their hot button.
Very good. Thank you. I found out we have 2 more questions that we want to get through, so I'm going to squeeze these 2 in here. What does it mean if a technology receives 0 corporate votes, but a high, let's say 4 votes from SDOs? Glenn?
It would depend a little bit on the technology. I'd have to look at it individually to form an impression, but without any other information, I would say that sounds like it's an earlier stage technology where the more entrepreneurial startup development officers have seen potential there, but it's a little bit too early for the corporates. That would be my guess.
Great, thank you. And our last question, who from the university would submit this information to NCET2?
We typically will see submissions coming from the technology transfer offices. So if you have an office that handles intellectual property, then that's the appropriate place to have it submitted.
Excellent. Thank you for answering those questions for us today. We want to thank everybody for joining in our webinar. There will be the video recording and the slides will become available in the next day or 2. You can find them here, so if you want to jot that information down, we'll make sure that they're available for you. And we'll have another webinar coming up in a few weeks on February 14th about the Corporate Open Innovation webinar series. So more on this, more information will be coming. You can also watch archived ones as well. If you'd like to submit your IPR startup, the link to do so is here.
Also notice that NCET2 will be at the Autumn Conference in Phoenix in February 18 through 22. If you happen to be at the Autumn Conference, please come by booth 715. You can meet Tony and me. I'll be there, and you can hear more about this program.
We just wanted to thank you again for being part of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please reach out. We'd love to answer them for you. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.